I'm not proud of this, and I'm not looking for sympathy. This is just me putting something down that's been rattling around in my head for years. Call it a confession, call it a life story, whatever fits. My name's William, and this happened back when I was broke, bitter, and convinced the world owed me something it wasn't paying up. At the time, I was doing short-term labor jobs, construction sites, renovations, anything that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions. One site in particular sticks with me. Big commercial build, lots of noise, lots of materials lying around, and almost zero accountability once the foreman clocked out. Stuff went missing all the time. Everyone knew it. No one talked about it. My motive wasn't some grand criminal ambition. It was smaller and uglier than that: rent due, truck on its last breath, and a growing resentment watching thousands of dollars worth of materials sit out in the open while I was counting coins for gas. I told myself I wasn't really stealing, just redistributing waste. That lie came easily back then. The plan started as a simple materials grab. A few bundles here and there, nothing that would stop the project or raise alarms. I figured the costs would get absorbed, written off, forgotten. What I didn't factor in, what I couldn't have known, I tell myself, was how fragile other people's work really is when you mess with the wrong thing, even by accident. That's where this story actually begins. Once the idea lodged itself in my head, it didn't feel like a crime anymore, it felt like a project. That's how I framed it to myself, anyway. Projects have steps. Projects are logical. Crimes are emotional, messy things done by desperate people, and I didn't want to see myself that way. I started paying closer attention on site. Who left early? Which storage containers got locked and which ones were temporarily unsecured for weeks on end? What materials were stacked near the fence versus buried deep in the site? I memorized routines without meaning to: Tuesday deliveries, Thursday inspections, Fridays when everyone just wanted to disappear by noon. I also made sure not to stand out. I showed up early, worked hard, kept my head down. I helped guys carry stuff even when it wasn't my job. That kind of thing buys you invisibility. People stop really seeing you when you're reliable. At home, I cleared space in my garage like I was expecting a delivery. I borrowed a tarp from a friend under the excuse of hauling junk. I checked my truck twice: tires, lights, tailgate latch. The funny thing is, I was more nervous about getting pulled over for a broken taillight than I was about stealing anything. I told myself I'd only take what I could move alone. No forklifts. No help. No witnesses. In my head, that made it cleaner. Safer. Like setting rules somehow made it moral. Looking back, that was the moment I crossed the line, not when I took something, but when I planned to. Everything after that was just follow-through. The hardest part wasn't what to take. It was when. Construction sites have a weird rhythm. They're chaotic during the day, but after hours they feel abandoned in a way that's almost inviting. Not empty, just unsupervised. Like a party everyone forgot to shut down. I picked a Wednesday. No inspection scheduled, no big delivery coming the next morning that would make anyone count inventory too closely. The weather forecast said rain overnight, which I figured would work in my favor. Fewer people hanging around, fewer reasons for anyone to notice a truck pulling up late. All day, my nerves buzzed under my skin. I kept replaying the plan in my head while I worked: what I'd grab, how long it would take, where I'd park. Every loud noise made me jump. Every passing glance felt like suspicion, even though no one was actually watching me. I remember standing near the fence during lunch, staring at a stack of materials I'd already mentally claimed. Lumber, some metal framing, nothing flashy. Then my eyes drifted to a partially finished section nearby, someone else's work in progress. Clean lines, careful measurements. It didn't register as important at the time. Just another part of the site. That should have been the warning bell. By the end of the day, I was exhausted from pretending everything was normal. When the foreman called it, and people started packing up, I felt this twisted mix of relief and dread. The moment was coming whether I was ready or not. I clocked out like usual, waved goodbye like usual, and drove off like usual. I just didn't go home. I parked a few blocks away and killed the engine. The sudden quiet was loud. You don't realize how much noise you live in until you shut it all off and sit there with your own thoughts breathing down your neck. I waited longer than I planned to. 20 minutes turned into 40. I watched people drive past, headlights sweeping over my windshield like searchlights. Every time a car slowed, my heart kicked up a notch. I kept telling myself I was just another guy sitting in a truck, killing time. Nothing suspicious about that, right? I replayed my excuses while I waited. They won't miss it. Insurance exists. Everyone does this. I clung to those lines like they were facts instead of comfort blankets. Underneath all that rationalizing was a simple truth I didn't want to say out loud. I was scared, but I was also excited. When the sight finally went dark, real dark, not just end of shift, dark, I pulled back around. The rain had started, light but steady, tapping on the roof of the truck like it was counting down. The gate wasn't locked. It never was. I remember thinking how absurd that felt, how easy it was, like the world was daring me to do it. I rolled in slow, headlights off, guiding myself by memory and the faint glow from nearby streetlights. The place looked different at night. Bigger. Emptier. Every shadow felt intentional, like it was watching me. I shut the truck off and just sat there for a second, hands on the wheel. This was the last moment I could have backed out without consequence. No one would have known. No harm done. Instead, I opened the door and stepped into the rain. The smell hit me first, wet concrete, oil, that sharp metallic tang that always hangs around construction sites. It was familiar enough to calm me down a little, like slipping back into work mode. I told myself I belonged there. Technically, I did. I moved fast but not rushed. That was another rule I made up: rushing gets sloppy. I grabbed my gloves from the truck, pulled the hood of my jacket tight, and headed straight for the stack I'd been eyeing all day. Lumber wrapped in plastic, heavier than it looked but still manageable. I tested the weight, adjusted my grip, and started hauling pieces one by one toward the truck. Each trip felt like a small victory. No alarms. No shouting. No sudden floodlights snapping on. Just rain, my breath, and the dull thud of wood hitting the truck bed. My confidence grew with every load. That was the dangerous part, how quickly fear turns into arrogance when nothing goes wrong. That's when I noticed something wasn't quite right. One of the stacks was closer to a temporary support structure than I remembered. A scaffold set up holding part of a wall frame in place. It looked solid enough, but the lumber I was taking had been acting like a brace, even if no one had officially labeled it that way. I hesitated. Just for a second. Then I told myself I was overthinking it. These guys knew what they were doing. A few missing boards wouldn't bring anything down. I slid another piece free, felt it resist for half a heartbeat, then come loose with a soft crack that echoed louder than it should have. I froze, listening. Nothing happened. No collapse. No crash. Just silence and rain. I exhaled, annoyed at myself for panicking, and kept going. That's the moment I wish I could rewind. I was halfway through loading the last batch when I heard it. Not a bang, not a crash, just a low, unhappy groan. Wood shifting. Metal complaining. The kind of sound you learn to respect when you've spent enough time on sites like that. I turned slowly, like moving too fast might make it worse. The scaffold hadn't collapsed, but it had sagged, just enough to throw everything out of alignment. A framed section of wall leaned where it hadn't before, resting at an angle that made my stomach drop. Someone had spent hours squaring that thing up, measuring, remeasuring, making sure it was perfect. Now it looked tired. Wrong. I stepped closer, rain soaking through my boots, trying to figure out if I could undo what I'd done. I nudged one of the boards back into place, hoping it would magically support everything again. It didn't. The structure shifted another inch, nails squealing as they took weight they weren't meant to carry. That's when panic really set in. I wasn't just stealing anymore. I was actively breaking something. Not materials, work. Someone's careful effort. Someone's paycheck, maybe. I pictured a crew showing up in the morning, scratching their heads, arguing over whose fault it was. Delays. Rebuilds. Maybe even injuries if it failed later. I told myself to stop touching it, but my hands wouldn't listen. I tried bracing it with one of the boards I hadn't loaded yet, jamming it in at an angle like that would help. It looked pathetic. Like putting a band-aid on a cracked foundation. The rain picked up, drumming louder now, and I suddenly became very aware of how exposed I was. Headlights on the street. A security car maybe. Anyone could roll by and see me standing there next to a half-damaged structure and a truck full of stolen materials. That's when I made the worst decision of the night. I walked away from the damage, climbed into the truck, and told myself it wasn't that bad. The engine sounded too loud when I turned the key, like it was announcing me to the whole block. I winced and waited for something, anything, to happen. A shout. A siren. A flashlight beam cutting through the rain. Nothing. I pulled out slow, tires crunching over gravel, forcing myself not to look back at the sight in the mirror. I knew if I did, I'd see that crooked frame again, leaning like it was exhausted, and I might do something stupid, like go back and make it worse trying to fix it. Once I hit the main road, adrenaline took over. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel tighter just to keep the truck straight. Every red light felt like a trap. Every car behind me was suddenly a cop in my head. I kept rehearsing explanations I'd never get the chance to use, just working late. Wrong turn. Borrowed materials. By the time I got home, the rain had soaked everything, including me. I backed into the garage, shut the door, and just stood there staring at the truck bed. What had looked like free materials earlier now looked heavy in a different way. Guilty. Earned by accident and cowardice. I unloaded in silence, stacking the lumber neatly, like treating it with respect might balance things out. It didn't. All I could think about was that wall section, waiting for morning. Waiting for someone else to discover what I'd done. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that groan again, the sound of something giving up just enough to cause real trouble later. I showed up to the site the next morning like nothing happened. Same boots, same coffee, same nods to the guys at the gate. Inside, though, I felt like I was walking back into a crime scene I'd already fled. People were quieter than usual. Not silent, but focused in that way that means something's off. I caught fragments of conversation as I passed. Doesn't line up, that wasn't like that yesterday, we're gonna have to redo it. Each word landed like a small punch to the ribs. When I finally saw it, my stomach dropped all over again. They'd cordoned off the area with tape. The wall section had shifted more overnight, enough that it was clearly unsafe. A foreman was pacing with a clipboard, jaw tight, while two guys stood there with that defeated posture you only get when hours of work vanish for reasons no one can neatly explain. I forced myself to look confused, concerned. I even asked what happened, which felt like crossing some extra moral line I hadn't known existed. One of the guys shrugged and said something about materials going missing, support being compromised. Could have been bad, he added. Someone could have been under it. That part stuck with me. No one accused anyone outright. That was almost worse. They talked about it like an accident, a mystery, an unfortunate setback. But I could feel the frustration buzzing in the air, especially from the crew who built it. Lost time meant lost money. Lost trust. Maybe lost jobs if things stacked up wrong. I kept my head down all day, working slower than usual, afraid that if I moved too confidently someone would see right through me. Every hammer strike sounded like an accusation. Every measurement felt like a reminder of how carelessly I'd undone someone else's precision. By the time I clocked out, the materials were still in my garage, and they felt heavier than they had the night before. That evening, I stood in my garage for a long time, staring at the stack of lumber like it might say something first. In daylight it looked ordinary. Innocent even. Just wood. Just materials. Nothing that screamed this ruined someone's week. I started bargaining with myself. Maybe the structure was already weak. Maybe someone else had moved something earlier. Maybe the rain did more damage than I did. Construction sites are full of variables, right? I leaned hard on that word, variables, like it could blur my responsibility into the background noise. I even did the math in my head. How much time did it really cost them? A few hours? A day? Big companies waste more than that without blinking. I told myself they'd rebuild it, get paid, move on. Meanwhile, this lumber meant I could fix my truck. Maybe take on better work. Maybe stop being so desperate all the time. That's the lie that almost worked, the idea that the ends justified the means. But every time I tried to imagine actually using the materials, I pictured the faces of the guys standing by that taped-off area. Not angry, just tired. Confused. Like the ground had shifted under them for no good reason. I thought about returning it. Just dumping it back on site overnight, pretending nothing happened. But the damage was already done. Bringing the materials back wouldn't straighten that wall or give them their time back. It would just raise new questions. Cameras. Investigations. A trail that led right back to me. So I did nothing. I closed the garage, went inside, and tried to distract myself with TV I didn't really watch. The whole time, I felt like I was carrying a secret that kept growing heavier the longer I held onto it. A few days later, I thought it was over. The wall had been rebuilt. The site moved on. No one mentioned missing materials anymore, at least not where I could hear it. I started to breathe again. That's when the foreman called a quick meeting. Nothing dramatic, just everyone gathered near the trailers, half listening, boots in the dirt. He talked about safety, about accountability, about how recent issues meant they'd be tightening things up. New locks. Inventory checks. Maybe even cameras. Then his eyes landed on me. Probably coincidence. Rationally, I know that. But in that moment, my chest went tight and my ears started ringing. I was sure he could hear my heartbeat. I nodded along like everyone else, forcing my face into what I hoped was a neutral expression. After the meeting, one of the guys from the crew that rebuilt the wall came up to me. He asked if I'd seen anything weird that night, any trucks, anyone hanging around after hours. His tone wasn't accusatory. It was casual. Curious. I laughed it off. Said I left right at 5. Said I was beat and just wanted dinner and a shower. The lie slid out smoother than I expected, which scared me more than if I'd stumbled over it. He nodded, thanked me, and walked away. I stood there long after he was gone, realizing how close I'd come to unraveling everything with one wrong word or one nervous twitch. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just dealing with what I'd already done. I was now responsible for maintaining the lie. And that's a job that never really ends. Weeks passed, and on the surface, everything went back to normal. New routines. New materials. A different section of the building taking shape. If you didn't know better, you'd think nothing had ever gone wrong. But I knew. Every time I walked past that rebuilt wall, I checked it like it might accuse me. It stood straighter than the last one, cleaner even, and that somehow made it worse. Proof that my involvement was completely unnecessary. They didn't need me to redistribute anything. They just needed time and stability, two things I'd messed with for my own convenience. The materials stayed in my garage longer than I meant them to. I kept finding reasons not to use them. Too busy. Wrong measurements. I'll get to it next weekend. Truth was, once I used them, the crime would feel permanent. Up until then, it existed in this weird limbo where I could still pretend I might undo it somehow. Sleep didn't come easy. I'd wake up at random hours convinced I'd forgotten something obvious. My license plate caught on a camera, a coworker remembering I was too helpful around certain stacks. I started jumping whenever my phone rang unexpectedly. The thrill was long gone. What replaced it was this low-grade anxiety that hummed in the background of everything. Not panic, not fear exactly, just the constant awareness that I wasn't as good a person as I'd been pretending to be. And the worst part? No one else knew. There was no punishment, no confrontation, no moment where it all came crashing down. Just me, carrying it around like invisible weight, realizing that getting away with something doesn't always feel like winning. The real consequences didn't show up all at once. They trickled in, subtle enough that I could have ignored them if I wanted to. But once you're aware of something, it's hard to unsee it. The crew that rebuilt the wall worked longer hours for a while. I heard complaints about overtime getting delayed, about schedules being pushed. One guy joked that the site was cursed lately. Everyone laughed, but there was an edge to it. Tension I knew I'd helped create. I started pulling back socially. I stopped hanging around after shifts, stopped joining conversations I used to be part of. It wasn't guilt in the dramatic movie sense. It was more like discomfort, like I'd overstayed my welcome in a space where I didn't fully belong anymore. At home, things didn't magically improve the way I told myself they would. The materials didn't solve my money problems. They just sat there, silent evidence that I'd crossed a line and hadn't even gotten much in return. The truck still sputtered. Bills still stacked up. The only thing that really changed was me. I noticed I was quicker to assume the worst about people. When something went missing on site later, legitimately misplaced this time, I caught myself wondering who did it. Then I realized how unfair that was. I'd become the kind of person who projects his own mistakes onto everyone else. That realization stung more than I expected. It wasn't just about the crime anymore. It was about the version of myself I was slowly getting used to being, and how easy it was to justify things once you'd done it once. I didn't have some big cinematic moment where I broke down or confessed to anyone. No thunder, no absolution. What I had instead was a slow, quiet reckoning that crept up on me when I wasn't looking. One night, I finally used some of the lumber. Just a small repair in the garage, nothing impressive. As I measured and cut, muscle memory took over, and for a second it felt normal. Productive, even. Then I nicked my finger on a rough edge and just stood there, watching a drop of blood soak into the grain. It hit me then how disconnected I'd been trying to make myself from the whole thing. Wood is work. Someone milled it. Someone hauled it. Someone stacked it on that site with a purpose in mind. I'd reduced all of that to a means to an end because it was easier than admitting I'd taken something that wasn't mine. I wrapped my finger, finished the job, and cleaned up. The repair looked fine. Useful. And yet, I felt worse afterward, not better. Like I'd crossed the last imaginary line that let me pretend this was temporary or reversible. That night, I sat in the garage long after I was done, surrounded by the leftovers of what I'd stolen. I realized I didn't recognize the guy who made those choices anymore, but I also couldn't pretend he wasn't me. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. Consequences don't always show up as punishment. Sometimes they show up as clarity, and you don't get to ignore it once it arrives. Eventually, the job ended like they always do. Final inspections, punch lists, handshakes that didn't mean much. People scattered to the next site, the next paycheck. I never saw most of those guys again. And that was it. No exposure. No late-night knock on the door. No dramatic consequences that would make this story feel neat or deserved. What stayed with me wasn't fear of getting caught. It was the way that night rewired how I saw myself. Before, I thought of my bad choices as circumstantial. Temporary versions of me, brought on by stress or money or bad luck. After that sight, I couldn't keep telling that story. Because nothing made me do it. I'd had chances to stop. I'd felt the hesitation. I'd heard the warning signs creak and groan right in front of me. And I chose convenience over responsibility every single time. That realization stripped away a lot of excuses I didn't even know I was leaning on. I took a different kind of work after that. Less cash in hand stuff. More structure. fewer opportunities to blur lines. Not because I suddenly became noble, but because I didn't trust myself as much anymore, and that distrust felt earned. I still think about that wall sometimes. About how close things came to being worse than they were. About how easily an accident could have turned into someone getting hurt. That thought has a way of sobering you up fast. It's strange what follows you through life. Not the crimes themselves, most of the time, but the moments where you find out exactly who you are when no one's watching. If you're reading this hoping for a clever trick, a lesson in how to get away with something, this isn't that kind of story. I got away with it in the technical sense, sure. No record. No confrontation. But that's not the same thing as escaping it. What I learned is that the smallest crimes are often the most deceptive. They don't feel dangerous. They feel reasonable. They feel like survival. And that's what makes them slippery, because once you start justifying things that way, the line moves faster than you realize. To anyone in a tight spot, staring at an easy opportunity and telling yourself it won't hurt anyone, stop and think harder. Think past the moment. Think about the people whose work you can't see, whose effort you don't value until it's damaged. Think about the version of yourself you'll have to live with afterward. I still carry guilt over that night, but I also carry the lesson. I pay attention now. To boundaries. To consequences. To the quiet ways you can mess up someone else's life without ever meaning to. This is me owning it, finally, even if it's anonymously, even if it's late. If nothing else, maybe this story keeps someone else from making the same kind of harmless choice I did. Sometimes the worst thing you can steal isn't materials, it's the integrity you don't realize you're giving away until it's gone.